Good evening. It's good to be here. I appreciate the opportunity, as always, to present a portion of God's Word. This evening, we're going to be continuing this last section of our study of the book of Exodus and talking about the tabernacle and some of the specifics that went into building the tabernacle and ultimately how it relates to us today. And as I was given this text and I was preparing some studies, I'll be honest, I struggled quite a bit trying to figure out what direction I wanted to go with this. I gave Brother Mike a call and asked for help, because I feel like we say this a lot when especially these chapter studies that we talk about how there's so much in these verses that, it's hard to capture in one lesson, and it's generally true. And, this is one of those texts that is especially true when it came to that. When I was talking to Mike and I would say, hey, give me some direction. When I was studying this, I want to talk about this, I want to talk about that, I want to cover this, and quite honestly, I just couldn't cover everything that I wanted to do. And he mentioned when he gave some sermons about this 10, 12 years ago, he actually did this in a two-part sermon to give you an idea of how much there is in this passage. So once I got some direction, I decided the way that I wanted to go about this is kind of a tag-along to what Dustin talked about last week. If you recall, if you were here, Dustin gave a good lesson kind of explaining how the tabernacle and the building of the tabernacle and the worship that went into it foreshadowed what was to come, and foreshadowed not only what the New Testament was going to eventually come to be, but specifically how it foreshadowed Christ and the things that Christ did on this life. And so the way I want to approach this text is exactly that. We're going to read this text. We're going to kind of pull out some different themes and some different subjects in this, and we're going to look at it and see, what it meant in this particular context as it went to building and worshiping the temple, or the tabernacle rather. And it will also look at, okay, how does this look when it comes to today and how it applies to us in the New Testament and building a house for God today. So that's we're going to be jumping back in those two types of mindsets, if you would. And so as I mentioned, we got these first 9 verses. I'm not going to reread this as James just did. But one of the first things I want to highlight here is that God told Moses to tell the children that they bring me an offering. And so as mentioned here, God is telling the people, so this is kind of where we're about to jump into several chapters worth of specific instructions that God has given to Moses, who would eventually pass down to the children of Israel, to give them very specific instructions on how to build the tabernacle, right? God is asking the children to build him a house, right? He's to build him a dwelling place. And part of what goes into that, number one, is to bring him an offering. That the people were responsible for going and collecting and building and in charge of organizing this tabernacle. And part of what that meant is that they were going to contribute all of the individual components that went into the construction here. And so I mentioned God over the next several chapters is going to give a lot of instructions here. But it's important for us to remember, and Mike kind of highlighted this a couple weeks ago in the intro lesson, that it wasn't too long ago before they are building this tabernacle that they were in Egyptian captivity, right? That they were wandering in the desert. They were out in the middle of nowhere with very limited resources. They certainly took some things with them when they escaped Egypt, but when you talk about all these specific materials and some of the specific parameters that God was asking them to build this tabernacle, there was a lot of resources that they didn't have on hand, right? So what this tells me is that the children of Israel had to be very creative, that they had to work very hard, that there was going to be some sacrifice on their behalf that they were going to have to do to be able to bring this offering together, to begin the construction of this tabernacle. And so when you think about that in the context of this particular passage and what that means to us, right? So the children of Israel, they're about to build God this physical dwelling place, this physical house, if you would. And so today, what we need to think about is what this means for us when we're talking about building God a spiritual house. And I think there's a lot of parallels today, especially when it comes to this, because God too, just like he did for the children of Israel, requires you and I to bring him an offering, that there are certain components that you and I bring to the table to help contribute to building his spiritual house. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4, it says, coming to him as a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious, you also, as living stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. You see, this passage is, in the greater context, is kind of entertaining the same idea of building up a spiritual house. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 it says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So you got this idea of this sacrifice, right? That there's for us, when we were thinking about this offering, this type of offering that we were to bring God in order to build up his spiritual house, it too, just like the children of Israel, is going to require some work. It's going to require some sacrifice, that there's going to be some things that you and I have to do to bring him this spiritual offering. So one of the first takeaways that I want to get from this passage is that, number one, God isn't going to do this for us. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit and more here in a second, right? But God is not going to, just like he wasn't going to build his own house, he wasn't going to build his own tabernacles or collect his own materials. He required that the children of Israel do that as part of this offering that he's requiring of them. Today, he's not going to force us to do this as well. This is something that we're going to have to do on our own free will. Next thing that we see here is it says from everyone. Now this seems like a very subtle, but I think is one of the most important takeaways I want to get from these 9 verses here, that everyone was going to be responsible for building this tabernacle. You know, building this tabernacle was a very massive project. This was going to take a lot of time and effort, as mentioned. And so what this means is that it was going to require every single one of them doing their own individual jobs, right? It was going to take a lot of different people doing a lot of different individual duties to complete this project. You know, and I'm going to touch on some of the specific materials here in just a second, but as mentioned, you know, because of their limited resources, you would imagine it makes sense, right? Why there would have to be all hands on deck, why everybody would have to chip in and do what they can, because of the situation they were given in, it was going to require everybody to, you know, go out they had a big group of people gathering supplies, you know, that they were going out and, you know, there was all these different specific materials that they ought to build, not only the tabernacle, but the individual components inside and the interior furniture. So there was a group of them, I'm sure, was gathering supplies. There was probably a large group of them that had to go out and barter and trade. You know, think about some of the real specific materials, some of the oils and the spices for the incense. You know, they didn't have that just on hand. They didn't have that just with them at the moment. So they, I'd imagine, had to go to different commercial cities and be very creative and barter and trade and you know, to obtain some of these specific materials. You know, they also had to be very creative about who was going to be responsible for building. You know, once they got the materials and once they got the individual things that they needed, how they were going to go about building it. You know, and Mike, when he gave this introduction a couple weeks ago, he painted this picture, right, which I thought to me made a lot of sense of how there was going to be a lot of individual subgroups of people working on different aspects of the tabernacle. Now, for the last 39 years, my dad has worked up at the Michelin tire plant down in Ardmore. It's right off the interstate if you're going towards Texas. And because of that, there was a couple summers that I got the opportunity to work out there. And it was really my one and only job that I've ever had in this type of manufacturing role. And I found it very interesting to see kind of the life cycle of a tire, right? And how, more specifically, how many individual hands went into constructing just one singular tire. I don't know how many square foot or how long the plant is that's down there, but there was ultimately just all these different sub-departments, that there was, at the very beginning, there was a mixing department. So you got people that are mixing the different chemicals and building the rubber just to, even make some of the individual pieces. And then from there, you got this, I don't know what they called it, the material section, where a lot of the people would build a lot of the individual components of the tire. So you got people building the sidewalls and the tread and the tubing and the electronical features. And so you got all these individual pieces, and then we get to this tire building station, right, where these tire builders would take all these individual pieces and they would construct a tire, It didn't look very similar to what we consider a tire, but they would piece all these things together, and from there it would go to this cooking and this molding station where they would put it in this hot press and they would mold it into what we would consider a tire, right? And then from there it would go to an inspection where people would inspect it for, defects and things like that. And that was just all for just one individual tire. And so there were so many hands, so many different individual jobs that went into building these tires. And so when I think of that and I think about this, what that scene looked like here when they were constructing this tabernacle, I imagine it was very similar, right? With these different people, you got people melting down the gold, right, to paint on it, to make some of the individual components. You got people, constructing the wood, and you got people sewing the garments and the curtains, and all. You could just go on and on about all the individual things that went into this tabernacle, right? This wasn't something that just one or two or three people could do. It was going to require a large number of people all contributing and doing their, what they could to provide. The same thing is true for us today. When we talk about building up God's spiritual house, it's going to require every one of us to contribute as well. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 14 says, "For in fact, the body is not one member, but many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not a hand? Or is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where would be the hearing? And if the whole were hearing, where would be the smelling? But now God hath set the members, each one of them, in the body just as he pleased. And if we were all one member, where would the body be? But now, indeed, there are many members, yet one body." We talk about this passage a lot, and I think typically it's a good sign when there's this particular groups of passages that we tend to cover, we mention a lot. It usually shows that there's a great deal of importance to it, and I think that's true when it comes to this. And so you talk about this offering, right, that we're going to provide, but how it requires every one of us kind of just doing what we can, bringing what we can to the table. We have all of our unique talents. We have our unique contributions, things that, you might be able to contribute that I can, and vice versa. If we're going to try to help the church, operate or to be as effective as it needs to be, it's going to require all of us putting in a certain amount of work. It's going to require all of us chipping in and contributing individually. We talk about a lot how, just in this local congregation here, how there's so many untold tasks that go on every single day. Probably 80-90% of things that we just never know or there's done without even being spoken of. I think goes to show, the type of people that we have here. But that's the type of things that we're talking about. Right? There's so many tasks. There's so many things that need to be done in the kingdom. And so if we want it to be as effective as it can be, we all need to chip in. He also says, who gives it willingly from the heart. This is pretty straightforward, but I think still important and worth mentioning. Kind of goes back to that idea about, this offering isn't going to be something that God is going to force them to do, right? This was something that they were going to need to willingly do and want to do, based from their own heart. And the same is true for us. When we talk about the church, God's not going to force us to serve him. He's not going to force us to read the Bible or to pray or to give or to help people. Right? This is something that we have to want to do willingly. There's a back in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus talks about how we are to give up, lay down our own cross, and if we're going to follow after him, which gives this idea or implies that there's a choice, right? That luckily and fortunately for you and I, there's a choice that we have on whether or not we want to follow and serve God or not, right? This isn't something that is being driven to us like a puppet, right? We have a choice, but there's also going to be rewards and consequences of that choice that we make. And so we have to understand that when we talk about building God's spiritual house, we need to do it willingly from the heart. I want to spend a little bit talking about some of the specific materials that's mentioned there. And I think it's worth discussing for at least a few moments here. As Dustin alluded to last week, God never does anything for no reason at all, right? That there's everything that is in the Bible, every decision, everything that God commands, usually there's a reason behind that. And a lot of those reasons tend to foreshadow what was to come in the New Testament, or foreshadow Christ and his church. And so I think when we read these types of passages, especially over the next several chapters of the books of Exodus, right, we're going to get some very granular, specific details of what God wants his tabernacle built out of and how big and all of those specific components. And so it's a good tool for us when we're studying the Bible to ask the question why, because generally there's a reason behind the why, and I think we'll find there's some definitely some parallels with some of these specific materials here, and that these weren't just arbitrary materials that God decided to throw out them just to see if they could do. And so number one, we see that there was gold and silver. God told them to bring to him gold and silver. And to me, this obviously implies a lot of physical value, right? That there was a lot of physical value that went into building the tabernacle. Gold and silver, just like it is for us today, is a very valuable element, right? That there's a lot of monetary worth towards it. And there was a lot of gold and a lot of silver that went into building this tabernacle. A lot of individual pieces of furniture was used with these elements. But when we think about, the church today, I think the thing that I would argue to say that's even more valuable than gold and silver is our faith, or is our souls. And the Bible seems to agree with that. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 19, it says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." To me, this verse is alluding to the fact that our faith is far more valuable than silver or gold or any kind of earthly element that we could try to describe here. And so when we think about the value, the physical value that went into constructing a tabernacle, you can see that there's also a lot of value, a lot of more important spiritual value that goes into our faith today. There was also bronze and acacia wood, which represents the structural integrity. It's probably a given, but this tabernacle wasn't a cheap, construction project built with a bunch of flimsy plywood, right? That the overall structure, the internal beams, the inner walls, a lot of the different pieces of furniture, there's a lot of this was built using this acacia wood and these bronze clippings, which this acacia wood is known specifically for being very strong, very durable. That this was going to be a structurally sound building, if you would. That wasn't going to just blow over with the first windstorm that came by. And so as you think about building God's spiritual house, I think you can see the parallel of how vital it is that we have a strong faith, and more importantly, what that strong faith leads to is a strong structural foundation. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 24, it says, "Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house, and it fell, and great was the fall." You see, there's consequences for not building a spiritual house with a strong structural foundation, right? That there's going to be consequences for not doing that way. And that's kind of what this passage here is alluding to. And so I think it's important for us to keep that in mind when we're talking about what building God's spiritual house today looks like. There was also blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen, which I think can easily represent the beauty. Just, we talked a little bit about that from the gold and silver, right? But you think about all of the priestly garments and all the curtains and a lot of the very intricate details that went into, sewing some of these people, they would use these very colorful colors, and Dustin talked about some of the importance of that these colors meant to them and what they even represented on a more deeper level last week, right? But it was obviously a very beautiful spectacle, right? This wasn't just kind of a normal, rundown shack, if you would, right? There's a lot of work and a lot of detail that went into it that made it very beautiful. And I think it's easy to see that obviously there's a lot of things that are beautiful about being a part of the Lord's church today. When we think about the beauty that we see in His grace and His mercy that He provides to us, when we think about how beautiful it is to be able to witness and be a part of His grace and His forgiveness and the relationships that we have with one another, right? That there's a lot of blessings that come from being a part of this church that makes it very beautiful as well. You have goat's hair and ram and badger skins, which seem to represent this type of external resistance. You see just like our own skin, you think about the purpose our own skin serves, right? It's meant to protect our internal organs and to keep a lot of the elements outside and from bacteria and things keeping infected, right? That's what our own skin serves. And likewise, they were instructed to use these very specific animal skin and these different goat's hairs and they layered them. There were several layers that went on the outside, kind of the covering of this tabernacle to help do that exact thing, right? To keep the elements outside and to keep the inside of it pure and holy. And so when we think about today, I couldn't help but think about, some of the lessons that Brother Brian gave in Ephesians chapter 6. We talk about the armor of God, and we think about all of the things that God has given to us to help also keep some of the elements of the world outside and to resist some of those things as well. God has given so many things to protect His spiritual house, things like, His Word and, our relationships that we have with our brothers and sisters in Christ, and our prayer life, and the list goes on and on and on, different tactics and different things that we can do to help protect our faith and protect His spiritual house from the fiery darts of Satan. We also have the oils and spices, which seem to represent this type of consecration or the act of making something holy, whether it was the oil for the lights or some of the spices for the incense. You see that there was a lot of very specific formulas, right, that they had to use these oils and they use these spices for a very specific way when it goes to, not only constructing but worshiping in the tabernacle. And we've hinted at some different areas or different instances in which people didn't do this exact command of God when using some of these oils and spices and made certain aspects of the tabernacle unholy and the consequences that became of them because of that. So there's this tabernacle is meant to be a very holy place. And I think when we think about believers today, we are supposed to be holy. We're supposed to be sanctified or set apart from the world. 2 Timothy in chapter 2 and verse 21 says, "Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from the latter, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified and useful for the master, prepared for every good work." In Colossians 3 and verse 12 says, "Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, and long-suffering." Part of building a house for God means that everything that we do needs to be holy, whether it be the actions that we do, the words that we say. Every single thing ought to be holy about it. Lastly, he says, "And let me make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." You see, the thing that made this tabernacle or this project so special and so unique wasn't the amount of gold or silver that went into this, to make it a very high-priced commodity. It wasn't necessarily the sheer size of this building or, just the physical spectacle that I'm sure it was. The thing that made this tabernacle incredibly special and incredibly unique was the fact that this was where God's presence was going to dwell among His people. You see, and that up until this point, this had not been a thing. And so that's why this was incredibly unique, and why everyone seemed to be very willing to contribute and to be a part of this project. Jonathan is going to cover this part in a few weeks as kind of we conclude this idea. But when we think about how this applies to us today, the Bible tells us that currently our bodies is God's tabernacle, and His Spirit, if we belong to His kingdom, His Spirit dwells among us. In Ephesians chapter 2, in verse 19, it says, "Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ Himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit." In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 16, it says, "Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you?" So you're right, today, that's where God's Spirit dwells. That's His tabernacle, is in the heart of those who believe and have follow after Him. So in conclusion, when we look at this passage here, as mentioned, there's a lot of things that, on the surface, if you had no context of, Old Testament versus New Testament or anything like that, that this would seem like a very specific passage, right? There's very specific details and materials that God is commanding them to use. But hopefully, we'll kind of continue to see this pattern as we continue on this kind of last part of this book of Exodus, when we talk about the menorah and we talk about the priestly garments and some of the more specific details that God is commanding him. We're going to see this constant pattern where this is not only foreshadowing the church, but it's more importantly foreshadowing Christ and the things that He represents to us in our faith. And so, if I could narrow down and give you with one or two takeaways from these 9 verses, I would say, number one, everyone needs to chip in. Everyone needs to be willing to give a part of their time, their energy, and their resources to contribute to building God's spiritual house. I think that's one of the things that, obviously the Bible commands that in the New Testament, but, I think about all of the different, mentioned tasks that are out there in the church, right? But that's not even talking about just here in this local congregation, but when we talk about all the needs and all of the lost souls that are not only here in Oklahoma City, but in the state, in our country, and across the world, one single person isn't going to be able to do all of that. It's physically impossible, right? And you could argue that it's impossible for 100 people to do all those things, right? But how much more can you accomplish, the more that you have when it comes to doing what we can and to building God's spiritual house. So everyone chip in and do it willingly. Again, God, this isn't something that I can come up here and give you a concrete, this is what we need to do right here and now. God isn't going to physically force us to do any of this stuff. This is going to be something that we got to willingly do. And I think you kind of see that attitude here in the children of Israel whenever they're given these commands, and Moses comes down and relays these commands to them. We see them just kind of jump into action. We see them just kind of all do what they can, have their own unique skill sets, and immediately contribute. And I think the reason that they were so willing to contribute to this was the fact that they realized how incredibly unique this was. That once this was done, yes, this was going to take up some time, this was going to take up some energy and effort, but once this was done, God's presence was going to dwell among them, right? And so they saw that. I think they understood what this was going to mean for them in the end. And so because of that, they were willing to contribute here. And so I think we have to think of like the long-term goal. We have to think about, okay, what does it mean not only today, to contribute and to provide what I can to the building of God's spiritual house, but what does it mean, tomorrow? What does it mean next year? What does it mean a generation from now of me putting in my all and doing it willingly, when it comes to how it represents God's spiritual house? So those are the two biggest takeaways that I want us to take away from this passage here. Appreciate your attention. That is all I had for the study. We never want to close, though, without offering an invitation. And so if you're here and you would like the prayers of the church, or if you would like to be baptized for the remission of your sins, please come forward and sit on the front row as we stand and sing the song selected.